but just kind of give an overview, really to just kind of jog your memory on stuff. In terms of studying for the AP exam, I think probably, I think, what is this? Oh, interesting. Um, Hold on one sec. I clicked on something. There we go. Okay. In terms of studying for the AP exam, using the like one of the review packets that I've given you that's really concise, going back and looking back over notes that you've taken. And what I would focus on, we sometimes have a tendency to focus on things studying, like we study things that we already know because we feel bad, we feel good about it, right? If you're studying something you already know, you go, oh shit, I know what this is. I got this. Right? Look back, try to figure out, maybe rank the units in like which ones you feel the most confident on versus which ones you feel the least confident on, and go back and really study hard the ones that you feel the least confident on. All right, so biological basis of behavior. So obviously, oh, what the heck? Okay, so biological psychologists study the link between biology and behavior, whether it is genetics, whether it's neurotransmitters, and how neurotransmitters, hormones, all those different things, how do they, you're right, I am supposed to be screen sharing, and I'm not. Thank you, Landon. There we go. And all right, how does biology influence our behavior? So we're going to start on the most basic, just like we did in class. We're going to build up from smallest to largest. So the nervous system is anything that includes the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. It is made up of, at the most basic level, it is made up of neurons, those little tiny cells that communicate with each other and send messages from the brain out to the body and vice versa. Okay, and so the nervous system includes all of these neurons, nerves, and then the chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters that they use to communicate back and forth. So first thing, we'll talk about the structure of a neuron. All right, so a neuron, what is also called a nerve cell, is the building block of the nervous system. These neurons, these microscopic little things, communicate. They receive messages through chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. They receive messages, and then they communicate with other neurons, telling our brain what to do, and this involves, our memories, thoughts, behaviors, anything. All of that is controlled by neural communication. We have a couple 100 billion of these. So hopefully we remember this a little bit, all right? There could always be, they like asking about the structure of neurons on the multiple choice, and so we got to know which part is which. One little hint. Now, this is not 100%, but almost always on the AP exam, if they give you a diagram of a neuron, chances are it is going to be set up from left to right. Okay, so that's just kind of like a little rule of thumb. So going from left to right, the part of the neuron that receives messages from other neurons, that receives where the neurotransmitters bind, the part of the neuron that listens to other neurons, called dendrites. Dendro means tree in Latin or Greek, one of those two languages. All right, and these are basically just the branches that come off of the cell body, which is also referred to as the soma. Okay, soma means body. Right? The cell body is a regular cell. It contains a nucleus, it contains mitochondria, all of that stuff. Okay? But then all the other stuff is what makes these very, very specialized. Coming off of the cell body, this wire-like structure right here, right, is called the axon. The axon is a wire, okay? Electrical messages called action potentials travel down the axon just like it would. Just imagine if you plug in your iPhone charger, okay, the electrical signal travels down that wire, just like with an axon. Covering the axon, right, is a layer of protective fatty tissue called the myelin sheath. Right? Not all neurons have these, but for the purpose of this class, they do. Right? The myelin sheath, purpose of it is to protect the axon, just like the plastic covering on an iPhone charger. Protect the axon and speed up the electrical signal that travels down the axon. Myelin sheath, and with some neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, the myelin sheath deteriorates, which stops those neurons from being able to communicate. All right, we can see here, all right, here's the axon, and then here is the myelin sheath that covers it. At the end of the axon, okay, as it gets to the end of the axon, depending on what type of neuron it is, the axon, the wires of the axon basically split off. Just like if you cut open an iPhone charger, all right, and took some of the plastic off, all the wires would kind of fray. At the end of the axon, all right, the axon does that to allow for it to communicate with multiple other neurons. Okay, the ends of these ends, okay, that contain neurotransmitters are called the axon terminals, or the terminal buttons, terminal nodules. You'll see it called a whole bunch of different things. But axon terminals are the end of the axon that communicates with other dendrites and communicates with other neurons, with glands, with muscles. Muscle contractions are from a message sent out by the axon, from the axon terminals. Right. So the neuron is the smallest building block of the nervous system. The neurons make up all of the rest of it. We have two different subsections of the nervous system. We have what is called the central nervous system. Think it's the center of our body. That includes the brain and the spinal cord. All of the nerves that come off of the central nervous system, that make all the nerves traveling down our arms, traveling down our legs, traveling to our face, all these different things, these are part of what is called the peripheral nervous system. Guys, if I say 2 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock. All right? You're slowing me down having to let people in right now. All right, this is called the peripheral nervous system. Think periphery, peripheral. Periphery is the outside of something. The peripheral nervous system is split into two separate subsystems. What is called the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. And sorry guys, it's going to be tough for me to write on this. since I'm recording, which is voluntary movement, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is automatic body functions. There are two types of neurons. Actually, there are three types of neurons in the nervous system. There are sensory neurons, or afferent neurons. Make sure that you know they love using the terms afferent and efferent. And does anybody remember the mnemonic to help you remember the difference between afferent and efferent? Yes, okay. All right. Same. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. Sensory neurons send signals from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Right? And then motor neurons send movement signals from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system to control our muscle movements. And guys, if anybody has any questions, feel free, put it in the chat, unmute yourself, whatever you want. All right, so as we said, the somatic, guys, I'm not really going to be able to go back to slides because I'm trying to get through, like this unit is huge and I'm trying to get through it in an hour. As we said, the somatic nervous system is what controls our voluntary muscle movement, any sort of muscle movement that you do on your own, picking up a pencil is the somatic nervous system. Sends signals from the muscles and glands, and then the muscles and glands carries instructions back on how to react to something. Think somatic, it's your body movement. Soma's body. The autonomic nervous system is what controls automatic body functions. All right? Anything that our body does without any conscious awareness. Blinking, breathing, heartbeat, sweating, fight or flight, digestion, pooping, peeing, vomiting. All of these things are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two separate systems. And these two systems kind of keep us homeostatic. Right? They're both active at the same time, right? But sometimes one gets more active and the other one has to step in to calm it down, or vice versa. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight system. When we are put in a stressful situation, whether it's you're being attacked by a bear or you're playing a sport, or anything like that, all right, sympathetic nervous system kicks in. All right, the goal of the sympathetic nervous system is to expend energy. It is burning off calories. It's using energy. The sympathetic nervous system automatically accelerates heartbeat. It increases breathing. It stops blood flow to the extremities. Okay. It dilates our pupils. This allows for us to have more acute vision when we're in a stressful situation, when our pupils get larger. Okay? It slows down digestion. That's why you generally don't have to go to the bathroom like while you're playing a sport, but you might have to 2 hours later, because digestion slows down so that we can conserve all of that energy. All right? The body's like, I don't give a shit about digesting right now. If you're being chased by a bear, it'll either slow it down, or sometimes if the fight or flight stimulus is strong enough, it'll just release everything at once, which is why sometimes people just pee their pants when they get really scared. I have a mnemonic to help you remember sympathetic, but I can't remember what it is. So it must not be a very good mnemonic. It's probably not going to be on that sheet because I didn't make that. So maybe they have one on there. The parasympathetic nervous system, right, is what calms us down. Okay, and as I said, both of these are active at the same time. If you're just at like a normal level of arousal, then that means that the sympathetic and parasympathetic are kind of just like they're balancing each other out. Right? Parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as the rest and digest system, because you're resting and it helps you digest, or it'll also sometimes be called feed and breathe, because this is parasympathetic nervous system. Like if you're having sex, your heart rate might be up, right? But it's actually the parasympathetic nervous system that's involved there. Parasympathetic nervous system, the goal is to conserve energy. Okay, it slows us down after a stressful event. All right, it keeps us balanced. People with anxiety, people with like generalized anxiety disorder, their parasympathetic nervous system is not as active and it's not able to like their sympathetic nervous system is on high alert all the time, even when it shouldn't be. Okay, so anything that the sympathetic nervous system does, the parasympathetic is going to do the opposite. Slows down heart rate, contracts pupils, digests. That's why you generally have to go to the bathroom like a little bit after either a stressful event or playing a sport or whatnot. One way I do remember my mnemonic for this, and it might not help, but parasympathetic nervous system is like a parachute. Imagine that you are jumping out of an airplane. All right, you jump out of the airplane, your sympathetic nervous system is active because you're falling through the air. You pull the parachute, comes out, slows you down. All right, and as soon as the parachute comes out, you're like, good. I'm not going to fall to my death. All right, and your body will calm down. So parasympathetic nervous system is like a parachute, slowing you down. All right, are there any questions there? Okay, and we've already said central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. All right, there is a different type of neuron in the central nervous system. It is called an interneuron. Interneurons are only found in the brain and spinal cords, right? And they are the connection between sensory and motor neurons. If a sensory neuron sends a signal up that you're like burning your hand, right? That signal goes from the sensory neuron to interneurons, and then the interneurons communicate with the motor neurons telling you to pull your hand away. So the interneuron is like the intermediary between sensory and motor neurons. All right? How much of your neurons are interneurons? I believe the vast majority of our neurons are interneurons. I don't remember the exact number, but I'm pretty sure the vast majority of the neurons in our central nervous system are considered interneurons. All right, any questions there? Okay, all right, moving on to the next PowerPoint. Neural communication. All right. Sorry, it's going very slow. Okay. All right, so I would say probably the hardest part of this unit is the part regarding neural communication, how neurons communicate with each other. So something to remember, right? Within a neuron, signals that travel in a neuron are electrical signals. Communication within a neuron is electrical. Communication between neurons is chemical. There's the action potential, and then the action potential causes the release of the chemical messengers, neurotransmitters. So let me see how. So when a neuron is not doing anything, when it is not being used, it is said to have what is called resting potential. It is resting, it's just chilling, but it has the ability to do something. It has the ability to communicate with other neurons. You're sitting there quietly on the couch, you have the ability to talk to other people, you're just not doing it right then. When a neuron has resting potential, okay, I doubt you would be asked this specifically, but you could be. All right. When they have resting potential, there are positively charged sodium ions on the outside of the neuron and negatively charged potassium neurons, or potassium ions, not neurons, ions, on the inside. Okay? It is what is called polarized, meaning it is extremely negative on the inside. Generally sits at about negative 70 millivolts. So you can see right there. When there is a neural impulse, okay, when neurotransmitters bind at the receptor sites on dendrites, if there is enough of the chemical signal, then that chemical signal is going to trigger an electrical impulse within the neuron, in the cell body. Okay, it's actually at a spot on the neuron called the axon hillock that you don't need to know. Okay? And this is in response to some sort of event. Your boyfriend breaks up with you. Okay? That's going to cause action potential. You're going to start crying and whatnot. Okay? This event, whatever it is that these neurons are reacting to, causes the inside of the neuron, when there is an action potential, that electrical signal travels down the length of the axon, and it makes the neuron go from negative 70 millivolts at resting potential to around positive 30 millivolts at action potential. It does what is called, it causes it to depolarize. It's not as extremely negative. And this is caused by the activity on the dendrites. All right? These action potentials, an action potential occurs if the intensity of whatever stimulus is strong enough. If somebody punches you in the arm, okay, the intensity of that stimulus is strong enough for that signal to reach what is called the threshold. The threshold is the minimum stimulation that a neuron needs, the minimum amount of whatever it is, stimulus, chemical, whatever, for it to fire. Okay? This threshold occurs once the depolarization has reached negative 55 millivolts. So you can see, all right, there's a stimulus right here. Something happens in your environment or whatnot, or a memory or anything, and the inside of the axon starts to depolarize. Once it reaches negative 55 millivolts, then that is going to trigger that electrical signal, you can see right here, to travel down the length of the axon. All right? That is what triggers the electrical current, the action potential. Now, hopefully we remember, right? These are, neurons are referred to, action potentials are referred to as all or none. That means if the intensity of the stimulus causes the neuron to depolarize to negative 55 millivolts, that neuron is firing no matter what. Okay? And it's going to fire at the same rate each time. Now, things can hamper that, like deterioration of the myelin sheath, all right? But it's going to fire at the same rate each time. It's like a gun, all right? If you're pulling the trigger of a gun, all right, once you reach the certain amount of poundage, 5 pounds, something like that, that gun is going off no matter if you want it to or not. Action potentials are the same way. Once it reaches the negative 55, what happens is these positive ions rush into the cell, right? Negative ions go out, what's called the sodium-potassium pump. And it opens up, essentially, in the axon, we have gates that it opens up, and the electrical signal travels from one gate to the next gate to the next gate. All right? Any questions there? All right, so there's the action potential. After a neuron fires, so remember, this is all happening in a millionth of a second. And this is happening nonstop all the time. Whatever, anything that you are perceiving at any given time is because of this happening. After an action potential, right? The inside of the electrical signal travels down, and as it travels down, once it passes a certain point, those positive ions go back out, negative ions come back in, kind of behind the action potential, and it does what is called repolarization. As it repolarizes, it hits it, and then it falls down really, really quickly. This is what is called hyperpolarization, where it gets below negative 70 for a split millisecond. Right? During that period of hyperpolarization, the neuron cannot fire. Right? It has to recharge. This is called the refractory period. Right? It's like a toilet. Once you flush it, you got to wait for it to refill, and then you can use it again. We also referred to the refractory period when we talked about sexual motivation and the male sexual response cycle. All right, questions there? Okay. All right, so when there is that action potential, so that's the electrical component right there. Now we're going to talk about the chemical component. When there is an action potential, that electrical current travels down the length of the axon to the axon terminals. Do we have to know all these numbers? Probably not. Just know polarization. Right? Travels down, the electrical current travels down the length of the axon to the axon terminals. Within the axon terminals contain chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. That electrical signal causes the neurotransmitters to be fired from what is called the presynaptic neuron. They're released from the terminal buttons in the presynaptic neuron. They travel across the tiny little gap. You remember neurons don't touch each other, except for in the heart. You don't need to know that. Okay, they travel across the synaptic gap and over to the dendrites where there are receptor sites. Those neurons bind at the receptor sites, called lock and key. They just fit at certain ones. They bind at the receptor sites. If the chemical signal is strong enough and it reaches the neural threshold, then boom, that next neuron's going to fire, and so on and so forth, going down the line to send that message to the brain or to the muscles or whatever, wherever it needs to go. Okay, all right, questions? All right, so there you go. Once those when a neuron fires, it releases a whole shitload of neurotransmitter into the synaptic gap. Not all of it is going to bind at the receptor site. Some of it just chills in the synaptic gap. Right? As some of it is chilling, right, some of it is just going to dissipate. It's going to be eaten up by chemicals. The rest of it, whatever is left over, though, they don't want to waste because neurotransmitters can be reused. And so once a neuron fires, anything that is left over is going to be sucked back in to the presynaptic neuron, back up into the axon terminal to be repackaged and used again. This process is called reuptake. Okay, these neurotransmitters are actually, they're in like these little, they're kind of in like little boats, called vesicles that travel across, and then the vesicles bind, and then the chemicals come out of that. Okay. All right, is that the end of that one? I guess so. Okay, I'm gonna move on to my next PowerPoint. We probably don't have time to do all of the, well, I'll go through them real quick. All right, so there are 7, 8 neurotransmitters we need to know. All right, main neurotransmitters you need to know. Acetylcholine, main thing to remember with this is memory and muscle movement. In fact, with Alzheimer's disease, they found that that is partially due to the deterioration of acetylcholine neurons. Too much acetylcholine can cause muscle paralysis because it causes the muscles to just contract really way too fast, can cause you to suffocate, right? Asphyxiate, the muscles in the neck close up. They tighten up and can cause you to asphyxiate. Too little acetylcholine has been associated with Alzheimer's disease. Serotonin, main thing to remember with serotonin is mood. Okay, we just talked about it. Low levels of serotonin are associated with depression. If you think about the medication, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right, those stimulate the production of serotonin and elevate mood. Dopamine, mostly involved in reward and motivation and also attention. Some motor control, pleasure. Right? Anytime you do something and you like doing it, right, you're like, oh, I like that. I need to do that again. That's dopamine. Dopamine is also the learning neurotransmitter. We learn something, or you find out something new, you're like, oh, that's interesting. That stimulates dopamine. Stimulation of dopamine just kind of gives you a rewarding feeling. We just talked about this, too much of it. It's been associated with schizophrenia, particularly the positive symptoms, the hallucinations. And too little of it has been associated with Parkinson's disease, that's the main one you would need to remember, and ADHD. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is the fight or flight neurotransmitter. It's released in stressful situations. It is basically the exact same thing as adrenaline. It's just adrenaline is in the endocrine system and norepinephrine is in the nervous system. Too much of it going to cause you stress because the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's also been associated, high levels of it have been associated with the manic phase of bipolar disorder. And then too little of it is depression, although associate serotonin with depression. There's a different type of antidepressant called a tricyclic that affects serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, right, but associate serotonin with depression. Endorphins, body's natural painkiller, released if you're hurt, or if you're, the whole thing with like a runner's high, okay, when people are running and all of a sudden it feels good and they feel like they're floating and whatnot, all right, those are endorphins. You should associate endorphins with opiate drugs. Drugs like heroin stimulate the production of endorphins. All right, and then finally the last two, GABA. Okay, GABA is the brain's major inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning it stops other neurons from firing. It blocks the receptor sites. GABA is associated with relaxation. A lot of it's released as you're going to sleep. Right? People who suffer from insomnia or seizures, part of that is due to too low levels of GABA. Anti-anxiety drugs stimulate the production of GABA. So a lot of times they just make you fall asleep. And then finally, glutamate is the opposite. Glutamate is the brain's major excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning it speeds everything else up. Too much glutamate has been associated with seizures, migraines, and anxiety. It's also been associated with the manic phase of bipolar disorder. But that is what they think lithium affects. All right, so any questions about those? What I would do with neurotransmitters, guys, is just if you don't know them already, just make flashcards. Okay, that's the easiest thing to do. Kind of just got to memorize them. All right. I don't know why I have all this stuff on here. I think I did it in a different order at the beginning of the year. Yeah, I definitely did. Oh, yeah. All right, okay. So, any questions there? And try to get through the brain real quick. Why this is going so slow. It's different for each unit. I'm gonna make a review page on Canvas, and I will put the breakdowns for each unit. This unit is about 8 to 10% of the AP exam. But then, for instance, like motivation, emotion, and personality is like 18%, I believe. All right, so structures of the brain. We're going to go from oldest to newest, meaning evolutionarily oldest to newest. We're going to go from the brain stem, which connects to the spinal cord, all right, up to the outside layer of the brain, the cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum. So at the base of the brain, right here, so you see, here's the spinal cord right here, all right, and then coming up off of it, all right, just like it's like the stem of the brain, just like the stem of a flower, all right, is the brain stem, which includes the medulla, the pons, and the reticular formation. The medulla is the pacemaker of the body. Okay, the medulla controls through the parasympathetic, through the autonomic nervous system. The medulla is in control of heartbeat, breathing, sneezing, vomiting, any of it. It sends those signals out to the autonomic nervous system when it needs to do it. The medulla is essentially just there for survival. A lot of areas of the brain you can damage and still survive. Probably not going to be able to with the medulla. Way to remember that is Medusa. All right, if you look at Medusa, it turns you to stone and kills you. If you damage the medulla, it'll kill you. So it's basic functions. The pons. The pons sits right above the medulla. Pons in Latin means bridge. It is essentially the bridge between all the other areas of the brain. Main thing you need to remember about the pons is it plays a big role in facial expressions. What are called the cranial nerves are connected to it. And then it also does a lot in terms of regulation of the brain during sleep and dreaming, particularly sleep paralysis. The reason why we're paralyzed when we are dreaming, what happens is because the pons is involved in sending signals from the brain down to the body, the pons blocks motor signals coming from the motor cortex out to the body. That way we don't act out our dreams. All right, and then the other part of the brainstem we need to know is actually not a real structure. It's a network of nerves called the reticular formation or the reticular activation system. Reticular formation, only thing you really need to associate it with it is attention and wakefulness. All right? The reticular formation is what wakes us up in the morning, keeps us focused. Okay? It's what allows for you to like hear your name, even if you're not listening for it. The cocktail party effect, if you remember that, it is what like you're all of a sudden you hear your name from across the room and your attention shifts. That's the reticular formation doing that. If it is damaged, you might not die, but you will go into a coma because it just doesn't wake you up. You can't wake up. And remember, reticular activating system. It activates you. All right, are there any questions about the brain stem? If it's damaged, can it fix itself? I don't know, maybe. Probably. I mean, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, but I'm not sure about that. All right, now, still in the hindbrain, but not in the brain stem anymore. Sitting behind the brain stem is the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum, it means little brain, sits back here. Cerebellum is mostly involved in fine motor movement, balance, coordination, all of these things, and is also involved in classically conditioned responses. Any sort of automatic response, dog salivating to the sound of a bell, linking those things, okay, that is the cerebellum that is involved with that. Okay. All right, now, moving up into the forebrain, we don't need to worry about the midbrain. Midbrain is just a couple of little structures that we don't need to know about. Moving up into the forebrain. The forebrain consists of the thalamus, the limbic system, and then the cerebral cortex. The thalamus, it depends on like what source you look at. I think most AP Psych textbooks agree that the thalamus is part of the forebrain, although I have seen it in part of the hindbrain. But the thalamus is the top of the brainstem. Okay, the brainstem projects up to the center of our brain. The thalamus is the top of it. Okay, it's right here. The thalamus's main purpose is it is the sensory relay station from the body to the brain and vice versa. Okay, it is referred to as the sensory switchboard. Anything that we see, anything that we hear, touch, all senses except for smell go through the thalamus. So if you're seeing something, that information comes in, travels down the optic nerve to the thalamus, switches sides, all right, and then the thalamus sends that visual signal back to the occipital lobe to be perceived. Anything we hear sends it to the auditory cortex, so on and so forth. Okay, any questions there? All right, probably not going to be able to finish the brain, but we'll get through the limbic system. All right, come on. All right, so going out from the thalamus in the forebrain, surrounding the thalamus, it's kind of like a horseshoe. And you remember, both sides of our brain are essentially symmetrical with each other. They're not entirely. But surrounding the thalamus, surrounding what's called the basal ganglia as well, is a group of structures called the limbic system. Limbus is border. All right. The limbic system is mostly involved in emotions, hunger, and other drives like sex. And yeah, emotions and drives and memory. And all of those things are kind of connected anyways. The most important structure in the brain. The hypothalamus. Okay? The hypothalamus controls metabolic functions, meaning it controls our metabolism. It controls our sex drive. All right? So if you're horny, that's your hypothalamus. Okay? Controls when we are hungry. Controls when we are thirsty. It is on what is called a feedback loop with the endocrine system. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine system through the pituitary gland. And what it does is the hypothalamus sends signals out to the endocrine system, and then the endocrine system sends signals back up to the hypothalamus. It is also part of the reward pathway, what is called the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, in the nucleus accumbens. Okay, and so the vast majority of the dopamine.
Attention, please. The owners of the following vehicles: a Durango, license plate BTK 1853, a CRV, license plate FJM 3002, and a Ford Expedition MVN 4361. You're parked in our drill area. If you would move your car, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so dopamine heavily involved in the hypothalamus because dopamine's heavily involved in drives. The hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for the processing of new memories, particularly if we remember from the memory unit, particularly explicit memories, things that we can consciously remember. The hippocampus does not store them. It processes them and it sends them out to the correct area of the brain to be stored. Memories are stored all over our brain. Most of them stored in the frontal lobe. It is very close to the emotional centers of the brain, all right, which is why memory and emotion are heavily related. Way to remember this, all right, everybody knows the mnemonic. All right, you'll always remember seeing a hippo on campus. All right, and then finally the amygdala, little almond-shaped thing. All right, the amygdala, main role of the amygdala is basic emotions, particularly fear and anger. Okay, the amygdala is there to keep us alive. Okay, when we talked about like the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion and how sometimes some emotions and the high road versus low road, and how some emotions we feel them before we even consciously process what's going on, particularly fear. That's the amygdala sending out those fear signals. Okay, so easy way to remember amygdala. Amygdala and anger both start with an A. Okay, guys, so doesn't look like I'm going to be able to finish with the brain today, but I will. But tomorrow we're going to do Unit 3. I will try to finish up with the cerebral cortex and brain imaging real quick before we get going on Unit 3. Okay? If anybody has any questions, feel free to stay on.